This is the Infotagion podcast, discussing information contagion and our rights in a digital world. The UK government's online safety bill has been published in draft form for parliamentary scrutiny ahead of the final version being voted on in the House of Commons later this year. This new legislation will create a legal duty of care for tech companies to act against harmful content on their platforms and will empower an independent regulator to make sure that they do. I'm Damian Collins, and in this podcast, we'll be discussing the draft bill with Jeremy Wright MP, the former Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, who worked closely on this draft bill when in government, and Bertie Vidgen from the Alan Turing Institute, the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. We'll also be joined by our resident disinformation expert, Dr. Charles Creel. Jeremy, it's great to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. We've known each other for quite a number of years, but I particularly remember questioning you when you were Secretary of State at Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and I was chairing the Select Committee, about what we then called the proposed online harms bill. This is a piece of legislation that we've been talking about for years, has been quite a long time coming, and now we've finally got the draft bill itself that the government has published. I'd be very interested in your perspective on the evolution of this debate and the evolution indeed of the proposals to legislate, which you looked at very closely as Secretary of State, and we now see what's been published by the government.
Yeah, well, thanks, Damian, for having me. It's great to be here. And I do remember very well being cross-examined by you and by the committee. And you're right, it's taken a very long time to get to where we are. I'm delighted to see this bill. I think it's significant progress in the right direction, but I don't think the bill's perfect. And I'll talk about why I think that. But first things first, I think it is good that we are legislating, and in the UK, legislating ahead of pretty much any other country in the holistic way that this bill seeks to do it. So that is good progress. But the original intention, as you know, when we produced the white paper on online harms, as it was then, was to create an overarching duty of care to all platforms to keep their users as safe as they reasonably could. And I think all the elements of that formulation are important. But what's changed, I think, is a number of things, but primarily perhaps we've moved away from one overarching duty to keep people safe to a number of very specific duties. And that's a different formulation. It's a different way of doing things. I think we're going to have to work through what the substantive difference is between taking the approach of one overarching duty of care to keep people safe and several different duties relating to risk assessments and then material and content and so on. So it is a slightly different formulation to what we came up with in the first place. I think to some extent there was going to be some change inevitably, because saying something in a white paper is not the same thing as legislating for it, of course. But that, I think, is a significant conceptual change.
Absolutely. I suppose there's one primary thing that runs through it all and runs through the duty of care principle, which is that the platforms have a responsibility, and the legislation will create that responsibility in law.
Yeah, that's true, and as I say, that is very welcome, and I think we've moved a long way from an era of exclusively self-regulation, which most of us as legislators, and certainly you and I have discussed this many times, always knew would not be sustainable. What I think is encouraging is I think the majority of the platforms have come to recognise that too, and to accept that whether they like it or not, the era of self-regulation has to come to an end and government has to play a role. So this is a process that everybody now accepts has to happen. And I think there are lots of things to remark upon in relation to the drafting of the bill. But one of the things that's striking is that the way it's been constructed, quite labyrinthine as it is, places an awful lot of emphasis on the building blocks like terms and conditions, like risk assessments. And if those building blocks are not in themselves firm, then the rest of the structure won't be firm either. So we have to ask ourselves questions when we get into the detail of this bill, like what happens if Ofcom, as the regulator, decides that the terms and conditions or the risk assessments being conducted by any given platform are inadequate? What can they do about it? We know that there are several duties that flow from what you've assessed as a risk in your risk assessment, for example. But what happens if the risk assessment itself is flawed? So there's an awful lot to unpick here and to understand better. And I hope that the government's open to that. That's what we should get from pre-legislative scrutiny and then legislative scrutiny when we get to the bill itself.
Yeah, I think this is one of the really important areas of the bill, and I suppose it comes down to what are the companies going to be held responsible for? And there's one thing to say, well, they'll actually enforcement of the terms of service, particularly against illegal content, would then become a legal requirement with penalties attached if the companies fail to do it. It's a very interesting area there, and I remember very specifically you discussing with you on the select committee is that area of content where we're now going to recognise in legislation there is some content that is harmful but not necessarily illegal, and this is one of the most probably challenging areas to legislate, but potentially one of the most important.
Yeah, I agree, and then of course you have to look at some of the other structural niceties of this bill. So what you've just described, which is hugely important, the area of content that is not unlawful but is certainly harmful, is only a matter of concern really to the largest platforms. And that's fine if you think that this kind of danger, this kind of harmful material only exists on the largest platforms. Well, it doesn't. And we also have to concern ourselves, I think, with what happens when a small platform starts to get big over quickly and becomes something that has extensive reach and where really pernicious material exists. If that's going to happen, then this system has to be flexible enough to pick that up quite quickly. And that, again, is an area that we have to test.
I mean, obviously, you're a lawyer by trade and were Attorney General for many years here in the UK. Do you think in law this is a concept that the government has found easy to grasp, that you can set legal requirements for people's behaviour when it comes to content that's not in itself unlawful?
No, and I think that is difficult. But of course, in regulatory terms, we've done it before. So if you look at, for example, what Ofcom already does in broadcasting terms, it doesn't simply regulate unlawful content. It regulates content that is unacceptable for other reasons. So we're not in entirely new territory here. But where we are in new territory, I think, is trying to define a duty of care in the internet world where none of this has previously existed, which is defined closely enough to enable the platforms to understand what it is they have to do. And they're entitled to make sure that they are clear about that. But at the same time, reflects the fact that this is a very quickly changing landscape and that new harms emerge very fast. And the original concept that you and I discussed all those years ago was that this would be a duty of care flexible enough to expect the platforms to do a bit of horizon scanning. They are, after all, in the best place to do it and see the harms coming over the hill and do something about them. And I'm concerned that the more mechanistic approach that, to a certain extent, as I say, legislation brings inevitably, but which perhaps has been done too much in the drafting of this bill, doesn't allow for that flexibility and adaptability as the harms may change over time. But balanced against that, you have to recognise that an ill-defined, vague, amorphous duty is one that's very hard to comply with. So there's a real balance to be struck here. I accept that. And there's an effort been made to strike it. But I'm not convinced we are in the perfect place yet.
See, now, I mean, many people listen to the podcast listen from all around the world, particularly in America. And the duty of care is is a particularly English concept in law. And I mean, really comes from, I suppose, the idea that organizations have a duty to their customers, to the people that work or live near where they do their business, and that the law doesn't necessarily have to specify in each instance what they have to do, but could take a view as to whether they've acted responsibly and reasonably. And I suppose what we're doing now is applying that to the internet.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's wrong to see this by way of comparison with the criminal law or even certain aspects of the civil law. I think the better comparison is with health and safety law. If you run a workplace, then you have obligations to your employees, you have obligations to people who may visit that workplace. And those obligations, as you say, are not set out in great detail in the law. You have an overarching responsibility, and regulators and others will assess how well you've complied with that responsibility. I think it's also worth recognizing that the idea of a duty of care model, and again, this is the balance between specificity and flexibility, but the benefit of it is that it enables a sensible regulator, and I hope very much we will get one. I think Ofcom's record in this area is good. It enables that regulator to say, I can treat differently a platform where the risks are very low, compared to a platform where the risks are very high because of the nature of what it does. It can treat differently a very large organization to a very small organization and set its expectations differently. All of those things are perfectly feasible within a duty of care model. So it is flexible. It's designed to be flexible. And I think it has to be flexible in this space. And it is, you're right, a peculiarly British concept, but it's one of those peculiarly British concepts that sounds completely unrealizable in theory, but in practice does actually work.
I suppose one of the interesting areas will be, as this bill develops and goes through Parliament, will be not just what potentially is added into it as it goes through the House, but once the framework is established, and as we all know, there's always the temptation to add things to legislation. And I can see here that once the principle of a regulator enforcing a code based on duty of care exists, if new things come along that aren't covered by that, there'll probably be pressure from Parliament to add them in.
Yeah, you are right. And that's already starting to happen. So if you look at how the government has already indicated it might move away from the line it's held so far and suggested that, well, people are making arguments about online fraud, and that should be included in the bill, and perhaps we'll be interested in doing that. I think there's a danger here, and it's the one you've outlined, that this is already a very big and substantial piece of legislation. And the risk is that an awful lot of other things that are wrong or troubling online get added in because it happens to be an online bill. And I think that would be a mistake. The line here that's been held so far has been on two bases, really. First of all, that we're dealing with user-generated content. If it doesn't fit that description, then it shouldn't be within this bill, broadly speaking. And then secondly, that you are dealing with things that are in currently unregulated areas. If you talk about journalism, for example, whatever our views might be about the adequacy of press regulation, such a thing does exist. If you're talking about advertising, there are advertising regulators that exist. And I think holding the line to say, if it's regulated elsewhere, this bill is not the place for it. We'll have arguments in another time and at another place about whether that regulation elsewhere is adequate. But I think breaching your lines on those things will lead to it becoming the Christmas tree that you're describing and potentially falling over under its own weight. And that's something that none of us want. We have to keep this as focused as we can, recognizing that it already covers a huge waterfront of activity online.
Absolutely right. One I think other important point, which I just wanted to discuss with you, is the question of whether the duty of care to prevent harm is about the harm that is focused on an individual versus the harm that could exist to society as a whole. And I think here, probably in particular with tech companies, harm has been defined really by them as being based on American law, where you use the incitement ruling to the Supreme Court in America about direct, imminent, credible threat to an individual or of imminent illegal activity being incited by speech. But I think this is an interesting debate here about the internet does something different. When we're often talking less about one individual posting or one individual comment, we can be talking about the drumbeat of effect of a lot of postings about a common subject. So I think racial abuse is a good example of this, which might be directed against a person, but actually could motivate hate crimes against a large number of people in society, some of whom may never have actually been named in these postings. And I think it's interesting to think about how could this legislation be applied to that problem.
Yeah, I think that's all true. And you're right. I think this is another potential deficiency in the bill because presumably as a result of representations being made by the internet companies themselves, who, although, as I say, I think have accepted the reality of regulation, will certainly spend a good deal of time and effort now trying to restrict its scope as much as they can. They would much prefer that we focused only on the effect on an individual. And that's where the bill currently sits, either physical or psychological harm to the individual. That doesn't permit a concept of harm that deals with a group of people, a segment of society, or a broader concept like democracy. And you've made the point yourself in print and orally, I know, because I've heard you make it, that there is a connection, for example, between impact on democracy and impact on individuals. And you only have to look at what happened on Capitol Hill a few months ago to see that in action. So I think that it's a mistake to restrict our concept of harm too narrowly. And of course, the intention was always that we would address the impact of disinformation and other things on democracy as part of this broader agenda. The Cabinet Office has been doing some work on that, but it was always intended, I think, to bring those things together at some point. And if this bill is going to be the comprehensive effort it needs to be to deal with online harms and online safety in its broader sense, then we can't dismiss all of that. And in terms of the bill's drafting at the moment, there are some confusing aspects. So, as I say, the way in which it's drafted makes it clear that the harm we're talking about is harm to an individual, whether psychological or physical. But if you want to make a complaint about some harmful material that you've seen, you can do it not just as the individual who's directly been harmed, but also as other affected persons, as I think the expression is given. And what does that mean? Does that mean people who are in a similar group? It probably does. So it's a slight discrepancy, I think, that you can make a complaint to someone who isn't directly harmed, but when you're defining the harm, you're defining it only about that harm that goes to an individual. So that there's, again, a lot to unpick here, and we'll have to spend some time going through it.
Bertie, I just wanted to bring you into the conversation at this point, because a lot of the discussion around this bill, this draft bill, it has been around the issues we've been discussing, the duty of care provisions, the enforcement against tech companies for failing in their duty of care. But it was always envisaged, and indeed is part of it, that a comprehensive media literacy strategy should also be part of tackling harmful content online and helping to give users of social media platforms greater agency in what they see, how they interact with it, to be more questioning of content that they might want to avoid. And I know this is work that you've been looking at the Alan Turing Institute. I mean, do you think this is possible? Can we give people the tools they need to protect themselves from harmful content?
I think we can absolutely do a lot more to give people the right tools. I suppose the question is, what are we expecting those tools to do, and what do we think that they're capable of achieving? Because media literacy will be very effective at certain types of harm and on certain people in certain contexts, but there are going to be limits to what it can achieve and what it can do. If you're looking at something like hate speech and extremism, it's far less clear that a media literacy campaign is going to be incredibly effective there. And media literacy is one of these quite interesting things because there's very few obvious downsides to it. There's very few clear problems which will emerge from improving media literacy. A lot of people are in favour of it, and that's understandable. But we don't always have that longitudinal, quantitative, really strong evidence base to let us say this will definitely help in these particular ways. We've done a lot of work on misinformation, and that actually is one of the areas where media literacy can make a really big difference. And we've seen that improving media literacy will actually make people less vulnerable to misinformation. It helps them to scrutinize content more, and it helps them to be much more critical of misinformation when they encounter it.
But, I mean, do you think in your research that people can be, if you like, radicalized by conspiracy theories and misinformation, disinformation, if they see a lot of it, and if their experience, particularly on social media, maybe as a consequence of stuff they followed before or things that people have shared with them, regardless of what tools we give or how we encourage people to question what they see, if the flow of it is substantially in one direction, then that's going to greatly influence the extent to which they question it or not.
It's true, and there's a real risk of normalization in this space that over time, if you keep being exposed to a sort of gentle flow of misinformation and low quality content, it becomes quite hard to discern what actually is high quality and what is true. Again, and this is always a boring answer that academics give, but we do need more research on this. There's actually not that much evidence into the impact of content exposure online, and lots of the evidence that we have suggests that it's quite small. It's actually very hard to change people's beliefs. Most people are not that susceptible to just believing any one single bit of content. It has to be built up over time. But I think, again, one of the concerns here is that it's not just about general changes in the population, so the average person becoming, say, slightly more extreme or holding some slightly more concerning views. It's also about the people at the edges who become really deep down into these rabbit holes, and they really are at risk of radicalization, and they're very vulnerable to those processes. And it's potentially a challenge that we have those types of people who really could be harmed in incredibly serious ways from not being protected enough online.
I think it's been obviously
some ways it's been an interesting year and a half. I think that's an obvious statement everyone would agree with because of COVID and lots of other things going on. But it's also quite an interesting case study because the world's been introduced to new concepts that most people have had to think about because they're thinking about the virus. So the question of does someone take the vaccine for coronavirus? Is the vaccine going to be safe? That's that's a new concept alongside ideas about what causes coronavirus and how did it spread. And similarly in America, I think we saw this extraordinary position, which you talked about on the podcast quite a lot, and Jeremy mentioned earlier on, of the uprising, the insurrection in Washington on the 6th of January, based on the assertion that the election had been stolen by Joe Biden from Donald Trump. And in both those cases, I think what we saw was the more the anti-vaccine information spread, the more skeptical people became about taking the vaccine. The more the lie about the election fraud was asserted, the more likely people that voted for Donald Trump were to believe it. I mean, do you think this is information, this is data that's going to be a fertile area for academics to look at what the actual impact is of the assertion of a big lie on social media?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is going to become an incredibly interesting area of study. And actually, this is something which we've looked at. So there's a lot of studies which look at the scope and prevalence of misinformation. And that's really important because we need to understand how much there is, where it's appearing, and who's being exposed to it. But there's another question which we have to ask straight away after we have that information is who believes it? Who's seeing misinformation and who's then believing these falsehoods and starting to adopt very concerning worldviews? And actually that link from the exposure and seeing false content to then adopting it into your worldview, that is something which we still need to evidence. And arguably there's another step again from that is how does it affect your actions? And something that's really interesting with the vaccine rollout is that vaccine skepticism can in many cases be almost as harmful as vaccine denial. Because if it has the same result, which is that an individual does not want to get the vaccination, then we've got the same problem. Whether they're motivated by skepticism or denial or something else, it's the same impact on public health. So it's an incredibly complicated area, and we are starting to see evidence. And I think it does seem quite clear that all the exposure to misinformation is having a tangible impact on people's beliefs and their behavior. But we absolutely need to keep evidencing it much more. And I think, online misinformation as an area of study and as an area of civic discourse and political debate, well, that's quite a new thing. That's only really come out in the last 4 or 5 years that people have really appreciated just how much power and influence is being wielded by the social media platforms and how much we need to look at their governance and make sure that they are safe, well-regulated, well-maintained spaces. So we sort of are, we're moving very fast, but actually we still have a very long way to go because we've only been studying this and talking about it for a couple of years.
I think this is an important point, the point you made about looking at content which is maybe mildly skeptical to something which is a more radical opinion about an issue. And this is, I think, is an area where social media does play a role because the research done so far seems to suggest that people, once they set off on a journey, maybe initially through, in the case of a vaccine, searching for information that maybe to check whether the vaccine is safe, do people think it's safe, that could be registered as a degree of skepticism. And then on the whole, the algorithms tend to direct people to ever more radical opinions in that direction. And I think there's a legitimate concern as to whether they are responsible in letting that happen and whether the systems themselves play a role in radicalizing people. It's less about individual bits of content that are posted that people are exposed to, but the journey that the companies direct them on.
I mean, again, absolutely. And the concern is what do you get recommended? So you start off with one interest in something and you express a view, and then the algorithm learns that, it looks to reinforce it. Their goal is to try and get as much engagement as possible. The business models, these platforms are based around getting people onto the site and keeping them onto the site. And it's, there's often this, I think, wrong conception that they want to sell your data. They don't want to sell your data. They want to keep your data, harvest it, and then develop services which they can sell, which by and large is selling advertising. So they want to understand as much as possible about you and to keep you interested. And if one way of keeping you interested is to push you down into slightly more extreme views or interesting things which will capture your attention and are very provocative, they'll do that. one caveat to that is that I think no platform, especially with this new incoming regulation initiatives all across Europe and the world, no platform wants to have really explicit illegal content, because that raises so many financial problems and public relations issues. There's a real commercial incentive to get rid of the very worst content. No platform wants to have child abuse material on their site. It just would not make any sense whatsoever. But it's in the grey area of content where there's a debate to be had, where it is provocative, it does attract interest and attention, and it gets people very riled up. There is a bit of a commercial incentive for them to try and push that content and to let people see it. And I think that's where the real problem lies at the moment. It's this legal but harmful category, to borrow the wording from the government, which is going to be causing the most problems, I think, over the next 5-10 years.
I think that's certainly going to be the hot area of debate in terms of what's included in that, and a perfectly legitimate concern to make sure that legitimate speech isn't regulated when it's not causing, people may not agree with it, but it's not necessarily causing any harm, and getting that right will be really important. I mean, what do you think as well about the kind of if you like, the recent history of misinformation and disinformation on social media? Because it would strike to me that in the early days, or certainly if we go back 5 or 6 years, when we, I think, probably started to consider the problem as being a substantial one, worthy of investigation, it would seem then that the people who were creating this content, many of them doing so maliciously, their principal objective was just to divide society, to sort of create divisions and therefore tensions through those divisions. And they didn't necessarily care which side of the debate won or lost that argument. They just wanted to divide people. And then the next stage seems to be, once you've established divisions, once you've broken off groups of society from each other, you can then seek to radicalize the people you think are most susceptible to your message. And that would seem to me the phase that we're going through now.
Yes, and one of the big challenges with disinformation or misinformation is intention. So, and this is often the dividing line between the two. So it's misinformation when it's unintended. You didn't mean to say something false or to expose someone else to some false content. It's disinformation when it is intentional, and you have a malign motivation to say, expose people to false beliefs and try to encourage them to believe things which aren't true. And what we've really seen, I think, with COVID is that there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of people who aren't trying to do anything wrong. They're actually often trying to do the right thing. They're trying to share cures and health information with their friends and colleagues. They've found out some amazing way of solving the virus or checking whether you've got it so that you then know that if you do or not. And they're wrong, and they're false. They're not true. But the people aren't sharing them to do anything wrong. They're sharing them to be helpful. And this is, I think, the real big challenge at the moment, is how do you address that? How do you develop an effective intervention? The other thing which has become a really big problem in recent years is the rise of incredibly convincing bots. You go back 5 years ago and you look at most of the bots on Twitter, it's a little egg icon, the kind of classic, you don't have a profile picture yet. It's some random string of characters for the username, and all they ever do is just retweet other bot accounts, and it's all spam. So everything they're sharing is, say, links to dodgy websites to sell you knockoff trainers. That's a very easy bot to identify, and often they tweet on every 15 minutes. It'd be very easy to identify them. That's not the problem today. The problem today is that we have these incredibly convincing bots where you can't work out that they're not a real person. Also, chatbots are becoming so good now that they can have a bit of a meaningful conversation with someone before you realize that it's auto-generated, that it's a machine, that it's not a real person. This makes it incredibly hard to know who to trust. So disinformation strategies have really, really evolved over the last couple of years, and the means which are available to malign actors is just so much more impressive, or so much larger than it used to be, which means that we've sort of ended up in an arms race. We're now in a constant battle to try and develop better tech to find these malicious actors, take down their content, disrupt entire networks of bots, but they're also trying to invest money to become more and more effective and harder to find. It's a very hard battle to win, and I think every time that we make a breakthrough in the tech to try and find these harmful bits of content and malicious actors, they seem to very quickly have a response. And so we never can quite get our arms around it and really say that we've solved it.
A lot of the focus of the discussion has been around the major tech platforms, particularly I think Facebook, with Instagram and WhatsApp as being the major social and messaging channels that are available. But to what extent do you think we should be looking more wider than that? Looking at, obviously, there are platforms like Reddit, but even looking at the chat rooms of popular online gaming platforms as well. To what extent do you think that should be part of our thinking too? And Jeremy, I'd also be interested in your views on that, in terms of looking at the scope of the bill and the different platforms that should be brought within its compass.
Well, I thought Jeremy actually said a really important point earlier, which is how quickly this landscape moves. And you take TikTok as an example, which a few years ago, didn't exist in the West in any serious way. And even I can remember even last year having to explain to people what it is. And now it's one of the major platforms that we have. So we have to be on the lookout for these sort of rising stars. And again, platforms can disappear. MySpace was huge, and then it kind of almost completely dropped off. It's incredibly important that we look at the smaller platforms where there's a much higher concentration of harmful content and there's a lot less regulation and moderation. So in some cases, there's less regulation because they just they're not quite big enough to fall into the scope of any regulation that we have. And often when they are regulated, they only want to do the minimum that's required to avoid any penalties. They're not really interested in going beyond that to really look into more complex issues of user safety, because they often adopt a very strident free speech position, which is completely understandable and completely legal. And there's a lot of merits to that approach, but it does create some issues in terms of people's safety online. So we definitely have to be looking at across the full spectrum of the online ecosystem.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there is a danger to structuring your language in a way that's designed to give reassurance to the smallest operators who are likely to present very little threat. The Secretary of State will regularly quote a cheese manufacturer whose products might be commented on by their customers. And that is acceptable. It's a perfectly reasonable point that that's a very low level of threat. But I think, to be honest, you can deal with that by means of a regulator given the capacity to look at whether people are doing all that they reasonably can. What's reasonable will be different for the small cheese manufacturer compared to what's reasonable for Facebook. And I don't think you need to put rather more fixed limits of categories and things like that on it. I think you can probably do it by means of that language. And if you do it by means of that language, then you allow for the point Bertie's making, that things can get bigger and smaller very quickly, and the threat can move. And the threat does sometimes move. What we may see if we're not careful is the kind of harmful content we're all worried about moving specifically and deliberately from Category 1 companies to Category 2 companies to avoid the scope of this regulation. I think we have to be very cautious about that.
I'd be interested as well on what you both think about the question of the age profile of users as well, and therefore the design of the service depending on the age of the user. Obviously, the age-appropriate design code in the UK has been a big part of trying to create and set new standards for that. But there was also the big debate around age verification, particularly with relating to access to adult content, gambling and things like that. And that still seems to be a problem that we're yet to solve.
Yeah, look, if you ask me, one of my biggest regrets from my time at DCMS, it was that we weren't able to finalise age verification at the time. And the reason was no big change in policy, but simply because we hadn't quite got the, ironically, EU consent process done properly. So it would have been better, I think, to have dealt with age verification as a standalone issue. I understand the concerns about privacy, but I think they are outweighed and they can be managed. And I think it would have been better to have dealt with age verification as a standalone concept. But by rolling it all into this bill, which the government is now doing, we cannot avoid addressing it in the course of the discussion of the bill. And I am concerned that by simply getting rid of the Digital Economy Act provisions that cover this, but not giving clarity as to what we're replacing them with here, that we are not going to do the job properly. I think an age verification process, very much like the one we originally had in mind, would be the right way to approach this.
And maybe just add to that there's the trade-off with privacy is the big issue here, and there's a really exciting new crop of technologies called privacy-enhancing technologies, which are, potentially could be quite revolutionary in the space. There's quite a lot of very innovative companies out there trying to develop solutions. I think The big challenge that we have really is that all of the age verification technology comes down to having the right labeled data sets. If you've got the right labeled data, you can build some really clever tech and you can start to address some of these privacy issues and some of the fairness issues and explainability issues. So for example, certain socio-demographic groups have higher error rates than other socio-demographic groups, and often this can perpetuate wider social issues. But that labeled data is currently very, very hard to get hold of, and very hard to share. And there's a lot of people, a lot of companies out there, big companies, with amazing data sets who are unable to open them up because of a variety of challenges. I think if we can start to address these technical issues, we really could do a lot more to ensure effective age verification.
Just to wrap things up, I mean, one final question I think is interesting in this context is, users move between platforms, and we're already seeing a drift now where I think more extreme content has been pushed off of some of the main platforms, or in anticipation of greater regulation or greater intervention, some of that extreme content is migrating to alternative platforms. To what extent do you think that there needs to be a requirement to cooperate between platforms, so that, say, if you're Facebook and you can see maybe content that is harmful that's not being hosted on your platform, but people are sharing links to it on Instagram and Facebook, that you should warn the host of that content that this is going on, and that actually part of the duty of care should be a duty to cooperate.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's merit in that, and I think actually what we should be asking the regulator to do is to say to all platforms, you are going to have to persuade us, the regulator, that you are meeting your duty of care. There are a number of ways in which you might do that. If you are dealing with an issue that crosses platforms in the way that you describe, then cooperation must be part of your compliance with your duty of care in exactly the same way as some of the other issues that we'll have to wrestle with, like encrypted communications. What happens if you want to encrypt communications? I think you're entitled as a regulator to say to a platform seeking to encrypt its communications, well, how are you meeting your duty of care if that's the route you choose to follow? So I think it is perfectly feasible for a proper relationship between regulator and regulated to deal with some of these issues on an iterative basis. There should be the opportunity for platforms to communicate with the regulator and vice versa. And for those who think that's pie in the sky and hopelessly naive, it's not a million miles away from what happens in the world of broadcasting now. And we're dealing with the same regulator. So Ofcom has a record of being able to do that. And I think we need a legislative structure that encourages more of it here.
And there are some cases where we can already see collaboration between the big platforms. So in terrorism, there's a forum called the GIFCT, which is where different big platforms come together and they share databases of known terrorist content. And this has proven really effective at times of crisis, such as the Christchurch terrorist attacks in 2019, very effective at enabling all the platforms to work together to take down this really harmful content when it appears. But there aren't that many cases in social media where they're doing that already. And in general, it is for the high priority illegal forms of harm, such as terrorism, such as child abuse. That's where there seems to be the most movement so far. I personally am a little bit skeptical that we're going to see a huge amount of cross-platform collaboration. And apart from anything else, there could be issues there around the cartel laws and whether they're starting to become anti-competitive in some way because they're working together. So I think there are some quite big concerns there. But definitely, if we're really serious about tackling harmful online content, all the platforms need to work together with the regulator and with other parts of society.
That's great, Bertie. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah,
pleasure. Good to meet you, Bertie. Thanks, Damian. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Two notes from Europe and the UK this week. First, the UK's former Children's Commissioner is suing social media newcomer TikTok on behalf of children in the UK and EU who have signed up for the service. The suit, which is thought to be for billions of dollars, would, if successful, be worth thousands of dollars per child. The suit alleges that TikTok takes children's personal information, including phone numbers, videos, exact location, and biometric data, without sufficient warning or transparency, but also without parents' knowledge. While several social media giants collect this information, the suit focuses on TikTok because their data collection is, according to the filing, excessive. And despite this, it would set a precedent. TikTok
they do deny the charges, but they've been previously fined for millions from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and by the South Korean government. It's also been investigated by the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. According to Ofcom, despite a ban on users under 13, 44% of the UK's 8 to 12-year-olds use the service. Elsewhere, European influencers on a range of social media have been approached by a shadowy Russian PR agency operating behind a UK front with cash offers to help rubbish the reputation of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. The strategy proposed asked the influencers to claim that Pfizer kills more vaccine recipients than even AstraZeneca, and in fact results in bringing down the reputations of both companies as it's presented. The influencers were told to publish links to reports in Le Monde, on Reddit, and on the Ethical Hacker website. They were asked to present the views as though they were their own for a fee that's been quoted as being as high as the influencers wanted. Radio Free Europe published an extensive investigation into Pfizer, the PR firm supposedly behind the campaign, but found deeper ties to a Russian political campaigner who's previously worked on campaigns for both Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. According to Radio Free Europe, the campaign is designed to denigrate Western vaccines while promoting Russia's Sputnik V vaccine as backed by the country's sovereign wealth fund, the Russia Direct Investment Fund. RFE said, quote, "The fund has aggressively promoted Sputnik V, extolling and at times exaggerating its benefits, while also openly criticizing Western vaccines, such as Pfizer-BioNTech, AstraZeneca, and Moderna, and amplifying negative scientific results." Radio Free Europe chased down Pfizer and found they were owned by a UK firm called AdNow, which is part owned by a Russian political operative.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Jeremy Wright, Bertie Vidgen, and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all the proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you. Until next time.